being here. I'm privileged to introduce our speaker today, who is Christian Davenport, Professor of Peace Studies, Political Science, and Sociology here at the University of Notre Dame. Between 1999 and 2008, Christian was on the faculty of the University of Maryland, where he directed the Minorities at Risk Data Project, co-directed it. He continues to direct two projects, the Radical Information Project and Stop Our States, among others which I'll mention. He earned his PhD in political science from Binghamton University in 1992. Professor Davenport's vast range of interests and activities are not easy to summarize, but at their heart looms this question: how might we better quantify, analyze, understand, and respond to the causes of violent and deadly conflict in the world, not least political conflict, from genocide to domestic spying, that is instigated or exacerbated by repressive nation-states and governments, as well as the structural and cultural violence of racism, religious and ethnic discrimination. I'll read just, believe me, a select number of the titles of Professor Davenport's articles and books, some of which are in press, some in process, others already published, just to give you a little slice of the sense of the range and the focus at the same time of his work. Currently underway, The Killer Movement, Repression, Dissent, and Demobilization. Toward Never Again, an empirical analysis of ending genocide. Articles, Repression with Adjectives, unifying the study of bugs, bans, bombs, battering rams, and state repression. Transitional Injustice, Rwanda, Overcoming Violence and Building Authoritarianism. Traveling in Black and White, a travelogue of racism, reflection, and redemption. Conflict and HIV/AIDS, a global perspective. Many of these articles and books, some of them at least, are co-authored, including with people working at the Kroc Institute and the Department of Political Science here at Notre Dame. Book titles: Media Bias, Perspective, and State Repression. State Repression and Domestic Democratic Peace. Paths to State Repression, Human Rights Violations, and Contentious Politics. And I could go on, but these articles have appeared in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Political Research Quarterly, Comparative Political Studies, and the Monthly Review. Professor Davenport has held visiting appointments at the Transitional Justice Institute, University of Ulster, the Center for Advanced Study and Behavioral Studies at Stanford University, and the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Norway. He is currently working on a variety of overlapping projects involving state-dissident interactions in the United States, Rwanda, India, and Northern Ireland. Just the other day, Professor Michael Desch, the chair of the Political Science Department, circulated note of a recent Davenport and Molly Inman article in the Yale Journal of International Affairs, The Puzzle of Iraqi Mortality, Surges, Civilian Deaths, and Alternative Meanings. There's a good buzz and discussion about this article, but that's typical of Christian's work. It stimulates great discussion, some controversy, always useful, always pushing the conversation forward. His current project is on genodynamics, and the talk you're about to hear comes from that project. It's entitled Rethinking Rwanda, 1994. Please join me in welcoming the scholar that Professor Desch correctly describes as the hardest working man in academia, Professor Christian Davenport.
Thanks, Scott. I've gone through phases about talking about this project. Initially, I was extremely excited about it and talked about it a great deal. And then the response kind of came back on the project, and not everybody was happy about it. And as an academic, you're not really used to people paying attention to you at all. So that someone paid attention to the project and also found that there were some problems or some controversies with it. And then people threatening me and my family and some friends. I decided I wasn't going to talk about things for a while. And then after a couple of years, I then got a little bit feisty, upset, and I was like, okay, well, if that's how you're going to do it, then I'm going to do it right and come back. And so this is a 12-year discussion of sorts. So for those that are not aware, this is where Rwanda is. It's nestled between Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi. Kigali is capital, hence the star. Butare is the college town. Lake Kivu is like absolutely huge. Phenomenally beautiful place, marvelous people, and what we are familiar with, and unfortunately, is a tremendous amount of violence that took place in 1994. So in 1994, I was at the University of Houston, and an assistant professor 2 years out. So Rwanda didn't have all of my attention. And I'm not the only one, because this also happened in 1994. Kurt Cobain died, Nelson Mandela got elected president, and the O.J. Simpson trial. Now, if you're like me, then you're like, how could you talk about that and that in the same sentence? We're Americans. This isn't a bad sense. Only Americans could talk about this and this in the same sentence, because this is what happened. These events come up, so I did this content analysis of the media coverage of Rwanda. These three knocked Rwanda coverage off of almost everything and effectively distracted us, in a sense, from what was taking place. Now, upon getting to the University of Maryland, as happens many times in the DC community, a question came up that was rather fascinating. So someone got money from USAID, United States Aid and Development Agency. They received this huge grant, and written into the grant was this issue of we want to do something in Rwanda regarding conflict and peace. No one on the project did conflict and peace, and so if you don't use the money, they take it back. So basically someone knocked on my door and asked me if I wanted to go to Rwanda. And so I was like, what do I have to do? And they're like, all you have to do is speak with some memoir students about their projects and assist them with their methodology and maybe give a talk or two on human rights research. How long could I go? They were like, as long as you would like to stay. And I'm like, okay, so let me get this straight. I just need to give a couple of talks. I go to Rwanda and do whatever I want. And they're like, yeah. So this, for me, I thought was a phenomenal deal, and I decided to go. Before I go, I grab everything I could read that came out on Rwanda. This would be 1998, 1999. So I grab all these books that are on the topic, and I start reading human rights reports and start putting together an understanding of kind of what was going on. And in part, I mean, as an African American, I was the first person in my family to go to Africa. So I'm like, I'm going back to the motherland kind of joy. Now, granted, East Africa is not where most African Americans came from, but I'm like, I don't care. It is the continent. I'm going. I'm joyous. Whatever. While there, maybe I'll get to West Africa. I didn't care. I was like, I was going to the motherland. So I was pleased with that. And so I went there with kind of an understanding of what was taking place and a desire to actually figure out what had happened. So I went there not necessarily to do penance for kind of being distracted by OJ while several 100,000 people were dying, but basically that was kind of part of my approach. I was going for the family. I was going to make up for the horror that I thought I committed as an American, but as a scholar interested in political violence. I went to go figure out what had happened, to basically do justice to the events, and also to basically try to understand what was going on and improve our understanding collectively. So today what I want to do is kind of outline this 12-year quest, which is being written up into a book, but to kind of work through it, and I'll work through some more than others, but basically this is also the outline of the book, which is also probably going to be called Rethinking Rwanda 1994. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about conventional wisdom, kind of like what is it that we knew about Rwanda prior to my going and kind of immediately afterwards. Some of the implications of this conventional wisdom, then talk a little bit about the data that was collected during the process of the project, then explore the 7 dimensions of the Rwandan conflict and the political violence there, and then conclude. So, conventional wisdom on Rwanda is broken down into 7 different areas. So, there's some understanding of the nature of the killing. It was fairly diffuse and quite variable across the space of Rwanda. A type of killing, genocide, is the thing that we're prompted to pay attention to first. And if you're good and you're thorough, you'll also see some discussion, a little discussion of civil war. So, genocide undertaken by the FAR, the existing extremist government at the time, and the civil war involved the FAR taking on the Rwandan Patriotic Front that was invading in from Uganda. Perpetrators of the violence, principally the genocide, were believed to be Hutu. The number of individuals involved, not really clear. Part of what I'm going to argue is a lot of this stuff concerns ranges of values, and which range of values you select in part determines how you think everything else took place. So the number involved, 100,000 maybe to 1 million. So there's roughly 1 million plus individuals that are involved in this Gacaca effort, and they have in some way, shape, or form involved or been involved with or perpetrating crimes there. The victims, the identity, is believed to be mostly Tutsi and some Hutu. The number, again, values range. So this is the estimate from Human Rights Watch and a few other demographers. 500,000 is on the low, 1.8 million is on the high. That is even trumped by some other sources as well. The importance of movement, that is movement within the country of different individuals. People highlight that less typically at the time. The intervention possibility, the possibility that intervention could have taken place, this is extremely high, and in fact is viewed as a lost opportunity. That one of the tragedies of this issue is that we could have stopped it but didn't. And the reconciliation complexity, the complexity involved with trying to get some sense of truth and reconciliation here, it's believed in many respects that this is possible. The complexity isn't that bad. It's actually, given the simplicity of 1 through 6, the straightforwardness with which it's conveyed, we actually believe that we have a shot at the international community and definitely Rwandans think that that's possible. Well, there's numerous lessons from Rwanda. There's a lot of discussion about this. Actually, if you Google lessons of Rwanda, you get several hundred hits. It's amazing how many lessons from Rwanda were drawn, in part because of this conventional understanding. So, first implication, detection of these things, large-scale, principally state-sponsored violent activities, pretty easy to do. Rwanda is often spoken of as the most straightforward case since the Holocaust. Intervention. The lesson from Rwanda is act fast. Third implication, the RPF were fabulous. They did what no one else could do. They stopped the violence. Fourth, post-genocidal assistance. There was some, but basically it wasn't as coordinated as it could have been. There's also some bizarre kind of puzzles that emerged from it. So we didn't stop the violence through intervention or any activities like that, but when people got to refugee camps, many of them involving people that were perpetrators and did killing, we were great at getting them food. So this was a huge embarrassment once it became known, but this is one of these implications that emerges from our understanding. So the points from today, the points from the 12-year Odyssey research effort that I'll discuss, understanding Rwanda 1994 and its implications are conditional upon the acceptance of certain contestable facts. 2, relying on a large amount of evidence, I argue that conventional wisdom is essentially wrong on all points. 3, the new understanding and new implications dramatically shift what we understand about Rwanda 1994, how we conduct research on conflict, and conflict processes, or how we should, and how we should go about the business of peace building as well. This is where we're going. So the project itself, it's kind of funny because academics talk about different things at different points in time. Cool. All right. What became interesting for me was it turns out that myself and my team have actually spent more time in Rwanda than almost any group of individuals, but we never kind of actually talked about it. So some people talk about, oh, you know, we went to this and we talked to some perpetrators in prisons, and oh, we did a little bit of this, and we didn't talk about it. We were just collecting information. And then when you actually, when I'm doing this slide, I'm like, wow, we did a lot. Okay, so went to Rwanda 6 times, did interviews with government personnel, human rights activists, genocidaires, in and out of prison, survivors, bystanders. We did numerous focus groups in the capital city and also Butare, but a couple other locations. We conducted a public opinion poll, which was like, methodologically is the most complex, one of the most complex things that I'd done until India actually, where basically you were trying to like, how do you draw a random sample in a rural population where no one's really sure where everybody is? So what we had to do was find something that was in every location, which was a well, and then spatially drew like within a 2-mile radius or something like that, this kind of concentric zones, and then we're randomly selecting a certain number of households in each zone, and then from that house, the first one you come across, you go to every 6th one in that particular zone. It was just some crazy nightmare. We still haven't written that piece up because we got so disgusted with other stuff, but that's another story. Did this content analysis of all media coverage of Rwanda. So not Rwandan genocide, not Rwandan civil violence, just Rwanda. And just try to get a sense of internationally, how was this country covered? And this allowed us from 85 to 99 to get some sense prior to some of the violence, to get some idea of kind of what people were highlighting. Most of it's guerrillas. And, you know, and so there's a very diminished understanding that we have of the country. And then a content analysis of Rwandan government documents, human rights reports from Rwanda, as well as international organizations, which will be the bulk of the information I talk about today. And then served as an expert witness for the prosecution as well as the defense of the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda. And that's a much longer story. Several collaborators assisted with the project. Alan Stam, co-principal, David Armstrong, researcher, former graduate student, Cyan Loyal, current grad student, Nicholas Greenfield, assisted with GIS. It's amazing. The slide actually would list a lot more people, but it's like names have been left off to protect the innocent. So a bunch of people helped us anonymously, and so I'd like to thank them as well, but they get hurt, so I can't. The data collected for the project, this is why it took 12 years. Effectively, what I was trying to do was identify as much information as possible regarding everything that took place, all activities that took place during the 100 days. So starting in April, moving through July, try to identify all events. Then subset it from that to kind of all violent events. And then subset it from that to identify all deaths. So there's numerous sources that were used. Now this becomes somewhat complex. So some sources considered the whole country. Some sources considered only large-scale violent activity. So we have the 2x2 that helps us identify the variety of different sources that are involved. Now, initially with the project, we were using some kind of Bayesian methodology, which basically allows you to take all information that you're deriving, regardless of the particular level and how much information is collected, and then you're calibrating across the different sources to generate estimates. And that had been a large amount of what we were doing. We then kind of stepped back from some of that because it ended up involving some simulations that we didn't necessarily feel comfortable with, but it did emerge from the data itself. So we adopted a different type of approach, which was kind of like, let's take all the source material that we have, and we will take an estimate from all the source material that exists in a particular location at a particular time. What's this look like? This looks like this. And exactly what you do with the rows, so just take Gitisi. So one source accounts for 13,000. Another source accounts for 54,000. Another source accounts for 5. Another one accounts for 11. I don't like him, so I won't mention that one. There's a bunch of problems with a bunch of the studies, but you have this range of values. What do you do with the range? So part of what the project has done is all this stuff is available. If you believe that a particular source should be trusted more than others, then you're free to basically go about your business of analyzing things in line with what you think is most appropriate. If you trust government sources more than you do non-government sources, then you could take those. If you trust international sources more than you trust national sources, then you could use those. So part of the project is transparency. We've made more data available about the topic than anybody else, in part because we're trying to get away from all of the hidden aspects of the discussion of the data collection effort. So you could analyze what you wish and put it together as you see fit. But we maximize on basically taking the average value from all sources that were available in a particular location. I'll show you what this looks like in a bit. So fundamentally, what I'm doing in the piece now is trying to take the data that was compiled and then look at these 7 dimensions of Rwanda 1994, and using all the information that we have, these estimations as well as a bunch of other information I'll talk about as well, get a sense of what the range is, and then also come up with some ideas about which one we think is most reasonable. So I'll start with dimension 1, and this deals with the nature of the killing. So here we were just trying to figure out, was the killing that took place generally concentrated or more diffuse throughout the society across space and time? Is it consistent? Is it variable? And so we tried to observe what was going on, conduct our analysis, and then see if this helped us figure out if the killing was concentrated or diffuse. Why do we care if it's concentrated or diffuse? Well, this actually involves a bunch of things. So intervention is easier in, guess what? More concentrated killings. It's easier to do. If killings are more concentrated, this suggests that we have to focus in on a particular group of individuals in a particular place, which is a lot easier to do than if something is taking place in different locations. Now we need to wonder if this is the same group moving around, or it's different groups of people that are instructed, like in the hate radio thesis, different people are instructed to kind of get started. But it's just a preliminary mapping. What took place, when and where. So, I'll show you a few of these. This is the first of our animations. So, with our anonymous GIS support, we took the information, the data that we had, and we created this animation of Rwanda. So what you will see is these are communes. So what you will see is a particular commune, and all we're identifying at this point is if any of the source material identified that there was violent deaths in this particular location at all. So you can imagine if you've watched the same film for like 6 or 8 years, you see a great deal. One thing you see, it's diffuse. You have killings taking place all over the place. So part of what we try to do is, all right, now we have some sense of what was going on and how it spread across space and time. Time is moving in the upper right-hand corner, by the way. This became very useful for us to try to figure out exactly whether or not this was matching up with the anecdotal pieces that were emerging. There's a lot of individuals that write about what had happened to them, and we're trying to kind of take that information and overlay that with this information as well, corroborating as well as we're able to the different source material that emerges. Now, what becomes interesting is some people are more familiar with certain parts of Rwanda than others. And so they're kind of like zeroing in on the spot that they're focusing in on. We're actually attempting to be as comprehensive as possible and get a sense of the whole country over the relevant time period. Just so you know, we will get to a sense of how many people are dying in each one of these flashes, but that's a separate issue, and so we're trying to address this one first. What becomes, at a certain point in time, you stop going from flashes of violent activity all throughout Rwanda to certain smatterings of individual events in particular locations, and this is just a summary piece of if it had violence at all during the time period. So what you see is almost all of Rwanda had at least one source identified that there was violence, except for a few up in the north. That's usually attributed, so this starts in 1994, so this is usually attributed to the fact that the RPF was up north and that a lot of people fled that particular area and then went to Kigali. But you do notice that there's a couple other locations where there's no reported violence taking place. Dimension 2, type of killing. How do you detect the type of killing in a particular location? So some of it is an issue of who's there, who's engaging in the activity. We generally think of genocide as being undertaken by governments. A government targeting a particular ethnic group with a desire to eliminate them in whole or in part. The definition doesn't really say anything about whether or not it has to be government. It's just presumed that they have the capabilities to do it. So it could be some other actor, but principally we associate that with governments. Politicide is a phrase kind of created by social scientists to kind of address this kind of gap within the genocide literature, just focusing in on ethnicity, adding to the conceptions of what was going on an idea that it could be political opponents that's serving as the targeting mechanism, not ethnicity. Civil war. This is when you have a rebel insurgent group going against a government and people are killed in that particular context. Reprisal killings, I view this as the rebel group is forging ahead, so the battlefront is in front of me, and behind me is the area where that's kind of behind our battle zone. That's behind our zone of control. Reprisal killings, I argue, is when you as the rebel are killing individuals that are behind you. Now, I'm not going into why they're doing it. I'm just looking at if there's any evidence whatsoever of people that are being killed behind you. So civil war would be exactly where I am. Genocide would be in front of me. Reprisal killings behind. And this random bit where there's just people getting killed. We don't really know what to call this. So like in gang literature, they call this wilding. And this is just like people taking advantage of a decay in social order and engaging in violent activity. So as a way of getting some purchase and trying to understand what was going on, I basically focused in on a couple of categories. The categories for me were based on who's responsible for, who's in control of a particular territory, and if violence takes place in that zone, I deem them at least plausibly to be responsible for it, but acknowledge that even within your zone, there could be some random activity going on, and the only reason we would know if it's random or not is if we got back to the level of the event and then asked the particulars of individuals of what took place in that specific location. But territorially, we can kind of break certain things down. So the green represents where the RPF were located in early April of 1994. How we know where they were. Well, the Canadian military, luckily, had some satellite images of exactly where the troops were located. That took me 3 years to get. We then took that satellite imagery, took the troop locations, and then we compared that to CIA estimates, which we also compared to Defense Intelligence Analysts' estimates, which is where, who's the intervention guy? Cooperman's book. We calibrated it against that. We then took the combination of those three estimates and then approached some individuals that were in the former FAR to ask them do we have your locations down more or less correctly. And at the same time, we were contacting individuals that were with the RPF to identify where their troops were. We took all those 5, and then we created this boundary, but then we animated over time. Now, we do this because The killings that take place on the green line, that'll be the Civil War deaths. The killings that take place in the white, that's under the jurisdiction of the FAR. The killings that take place within the green, that takes place within the jurisdiction of the RPF. Now, the territorial control argument basically suggests that the killings in the white are plausibly genocide, politicide, or random. Civil wars on the line, back here, reprisal killing, or random. Whoa. Saw that one. Sorry. Okay. One zone, second zone, third zone. So what this animation does is it overlays the same exact killing information that you saw before. Was there any reported killing at all? And it's overlaid with the animation of the troop movements so you can get some general sense of command responsibility. So all this is creating is zones of control and possible clarification or categorizations of different types of violence that are taking place. Now, what you'll find interesting is, one, the RPF take over a lot of territory very quickly. They also hold distinct positions at different points in time for long periods of time. This generally is corroborated with a bunch of information provided by Dallaire and others on the ground about comparative kind of troop capabilities. Generally, it was assumed that the RPF could have taken the whole country at any point in time, and that the FAR were not that capable of actually engaging in civil war. Evidently, they seem more than capable of engaging in genocide and politicide, and thus we see that. What's also important, this is the French that come in towards the end. You also have killings that take place there. Now, I'm not saying that the French are killing them, I'm just not ruling it out. To figure out exactly the circumstances under which those people are dying, or any of the people that are in any of the zones, you need to get down to the level of the event. But the objective is to identify whether or not there's any understanding of what we can derive of what took place from moving these zones around and thinking of who's being killed where. And so now we get to these issues of perpetrators. Who's responsible for killing? So I then take the information that are derived from the previous animations and then go from that to kind of command responsibility. Genocide is, as I suggested before, undertaken by governments and their affiliates. So genocidal activity, that in front of the front involves them as being held responsible. The FAR government and their affiliates. Politicide, same deal. Civil war, the deaths are attributed to the FAR or to the rebels. Reprisal killings, that's attributable to the rebels. Random, you could have random from the government, random from the citizenry, random from the rebels. This is how we need to start understanding it. So part of what the project is attempting to do is we get away from broad categorizations of this thing was just genocide, this thing was just civil war. The key is to figure out all of what is taking place in terms of the events and identify the systematic relationships, if any, that one could detect between the different forms of violence. This becomes important because, for example, war crimes as a conception involves a relationship between two different forms of killing and a relationship between two different types of actors. Genocide is presumed to be territorial, under the control of the government. They engage in violent activity, but it ignores context. It ignores the fact that governments are pushing forward with their effort as they are engaged in some other controversy or conflict which could involve war crimes, for example, or an interstate or civil war. Now, when you're looking at the animation closely, which this is online, so you could look at it at your leisure, but what becomes interesting is the surges in the killing in front of the line follow surges and advancements of the RPF battlefront. So as the RPF pushes into the country, there's more violent activity that takes place in front of their line. Now, by conventional conceptions, the genocide is attributable to the government. That's who we blame. But the pace of the killing, we can lay at the foot of the RPF as they move in. Now, what's interesting is you start looking at trace evidence for like what the Clinton administration was hearing and so forth, declassified documents, show that there's all types of discussion to get the RPF to stop pushing into the country. They're not doing it. Their objective is to take over the country. But as an after effect of their continuing to push in, this then prompts killing in front of it. The reason for that I'm going to get to in a second. What becomes interesting, what becomes important for us to understand is whenever they stop, the killing in front of the battlefront stops and slows down. Whenever they push in, the killing in front of their battlefront increases. So how many people were involved in the killing? Remember, initially it was like, is it 100,000? Is it 1 million? Well, what becomes interesting from much of the source material that we have, this includes two sources in particular, Human Rights Watch and Africa Rights. We're doing this with some other sources as well. What becomes interesting is there's a lot of perpetrators being identified at relatively low killings. High amounts of killings, obviously it's not 1 or 10 perpetrators that are killing all these people. These are people identified by battle unit, by name. There's very few people that are identified in this zone, and at the higher level killings, of which there are quite a few, there are very people identified here. And this makes sense. Large-scale killings where 30 or 40 or 11,000 people are getting killed completely, there's no one left to identify anybody. That information's gone. So people that are getting identified are generally kind of coming from the lower level killings. And this makes it extremely difficult to actually make any estimations about how many people were involved in killing from that trace evidence. You could argue that how do you kill 20,000 people? Then you get to battle death estimations and you get to battle capacity estimations of how many people does it take to kill 20,000 people. So then we get to this understanding of, okay, well, a lot of people talk about machetes and that involvement. Machetes were one way that people were killed. People were shot, things were blown up. You go to the discussions and trace evidence on how you kill 30,000 people. Much of that is military hardware. That's how you kill 30,000 people. Smaller killings involve explosives, people being hatched, people being shot. The variation with the killing capability helps us piece back together the issue of what perpetrators are involved. Now, the victims, this is where much of the conversation has gone with regards to Rwanda. So first we'll address the issue of how many died. So this represents a schematic of considering the 5 sources that we believe to be the most useful. African Rights, an international human rights organization, the Minister of Education, Human Rights Watch, Ebuka, a Tutsi survivor organization, and the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and Sport. We also compared these estimates against the Minister of Local Affairs and so forth. So what this represents is when you use an individual source, what's the estimation that you get? And what's the range, the high and the low? So in these reports, occasionally, it's not just a point figure you're given for a death in a particular location at a particular time. They're like, well, it's between 100 and 500. So if you start taking the ranges that are reported, that gives you the top and the bottom part of the bar, and the dot represents our point estimation and estimations of the average. So if you take the individual sources, or combinations of 2, or combinations of 3, you'll notice you have these wide varying kind of estimations that then starts to pare down. So what we've done is we've only taken estimations that were in all 5. Very conservative estimation, but the one we feel most comfortable with. All source material identify at least a value, and then we go from there. So our estimation comes in principally there with a range. This is our median estimation. So the high end is 675,000. Low is about 310. 425 approximately is what we give as a medium range value. That's our medium range value, and that's the one we feel most comfortable with saying. But as I mentioned before, all the source material is available. If you believe that certain sources are better than others, the person is allowed to basically select what they wish. And this shows the distribution of values that you get. Well, now let's look at this animation again, except this time let's include information about the deaths at individual locales. So this will be the same animation that you've seen. The white is where no one was killed. Yellow goes from 10. High red is 75,000. This is a single day killing, can range from 10 to 75,000 in a commune. Now what becomes important to think about now is where lower level killings are taking place, when higher level killings are taking place. I tend to think of the ones that are between like 10 people and 100 in a particular location at a time. That doesn't take much technology. To kill 75,000 people in a day, that takes some weaponry. So now we're looking at military units. And so that's part of where we're trying to go, which is to try to identify these different thresholds and relate that to information about troop movements to get some better fix on who's responsible for what. The number of killings broken down by zone, so this is under the jurisdiction of the FAR, clearly the most. The zone of the RPF that's behind the area, the RPF FAR front, the French zone, the French RPF front, which comes later. Now, clearly, the bulk of the individuals killed fall under the territorial jurisdiction of the FAR. That clearly supports a conception of most of the deaths are attributed to genocide or politicide. Now, any that are familiar with the project know that in 2004, I got called the genocide denier. I don't deny genocide. It's right there. What I do, though, is I identify when people get killed, where they get killed, and what dynamics are responsible for or pushing that death. And I put that at the feet of the RPF. The spatial analysis we're doing now shows that, as I suggested before, the deaths, the surges in deaths, the surges in violent activity are calibrated to their advancements into the country. So when we think of who is responsible, as we think through the issue of how we think about causality, how we think about who is in need of being at least investigated or queried on the issue of what caused what, we need to consider the movement of these different battle zones, the relationship between them, and then think through that. In addition, this shows the number of absolute deaths by geographic location. This is not including the issue of animation. What becomes complex about studying Rwanda is many people pay attention to structural conditions. I think maybe structure mattered for about a week or 2 weeks before structure was completely irrelevant because you have to follow individuals as people were running through the country, both to kill and to flee being killed. So there's certain studies that were done that were trying to calibrate the killings as a function of the amount of prior political mobilization or the degree of openness within the government or presence of local military operations and so forth. That's just inappropriate given this particular context. So who died exactly? Well, there's estimations by Abuka, the Tutsi survival organization, that 300,000 Tutsi survived. How many people does that mean died? Okay, well that varies by a function of the total number. Now, we think the number that's most reasonable about how many were there beforehand was 506,000. I'll get to how we got to that in a second. But effectively, if 300,000 people survived, start with 506, 206,000 victims. Well, part of the importance of how many Tutsi were in the country in 1994 relates back to how many people left the country in 1959 and 1960. And how many people left the country while you were going through it. There's people leaving Rwanda all the time. So what we do is, same approach that we take with the data on violence. We have different estimation possibilities of what the Tutsi population was. After there's a regime change, the Tutsi leadership that was in charge at the time flees, the Hutus take over, directly following kind of what took place in Congo. And how many people actually left at that time influences, controlling for rates of growth and so forth, influences how many people were possibly there in 1994. Take UNHCR records about people leaving and entering the country and going to others. So we have a massive kind of discounting for that as well. Our general estimation comes to 506,000. But again, we make all the material available. If you believe it's a different estimation, then you're able to calibrate that and then go through the exercise that we're going through as well. So there's different estimations of the total. And so subtracting out the number of Tutsi that survived and looking at the different range of values from the high, or from the different values that emerge. So I mentioned our median is 430. Our high is 3 million. Now, if you start thinking of how many Hutu died, then that number varies by which number you accept. The Bayes median of 430 gives us 224,000 Hutu that died. You take the plausible high end, the 614,000 figure, then we have 408 Hutu that died. That range increases depending upon which source that you accept. What this suggests, though, is once one moves from the kind of conservative estimation that we suggest, the number of Hutu that died end up dramatically outnumbering the number of Tutsi that we believe passed. Now, genocide and politicide have nothing to do with absolute number. It's about intent to kill in whole or in part. So there's nothing to detract away from the claim that a genocide or politicide took place. But this does identify that a large number of other individuals potentially died as well that need to be brought into the discussion of what took place. Further kind of impugning the issue of exactly who was killed and under what circumstances, this is information derived from the Rwandan census on exactly what's the percentage of the Tutsi by prefecture. So most of the Tutsi were located in Butare and Kibuye. You'll recall this area flashing repeatedly, so we know these people were killed, and we know that does qualify under the potentiality of being genocide or politicide or random. There's also a bunch of flashes that take place here. I'm sorry, that I didn't realize this thing was going to be in the way, but if you notice the overlay of the massive killing, this is the summary visual over here. We have massive clusters of people being killed here, 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 and up there as well. Who were those people? They don't appear to be overlaying directly with ethnicity. So what's going on? Well, this leads to the argument I'm attempting to develop is that people weren't necessarily killed for who they were killed for who they were not. You could not demonstrate your ethnicity. It was just presumed that you were other, and in that context you were killed. Now this comes down to some presumptions about the ease with which ethnic identities could be made. So there's a presumption of kind of the Hutu and the Tutsi not overlaying, that it's clear to tell them apart. There's an argument about whether or not this is the case or not. And so I actually believe there's a high variability. There's a tremendous amount of overlap, which many people identify, which is why they talk about the ID cards, which is why they talk about the identification papers, which it's not quite clear that everybody was carrying with them after the violence started. There's contending arguments about that as well. On the side, this represents all the different ways that the Belgians tried to separate the Hutu from the Tutsi. Head length, facial height, lips height, I don't know, sorry for the font, body weight. skin color, none of it worked. None of the clustering mechanisms worked. Belgian phrenology is horrible. So if not ethnic difference, then politicide and genocide, political threats, the perception of threat within your particular location is what I'm arguing is driving the killing. This leads us to the importance of movement. Conventional wisdom had this as being not that important. I have this as being central. So this is one of those crazy top secret documents that I acquired at some point in time, which talks about these clusters of individuals, concentrations of displaced people in late April. They were running. They hadn't made it out yet. They were running, and this is where they clustered. Between 2 to 3 million is their estimation. You put that much of the population of 8 on the run with no clear mechanism for identifying individuals and all the reason in the world to just eliminate your enemies. Now, people forget the discussion, but there was discussion that there were massive caches of weapons that Tutsis and the Hutus that were moderate had in their possession to challenge the existing government. There's no reason to believe this wasn't true, because in 89 and 90 they were finding them. The RPF had established a radio station while they were in the north that was also talking about their brothers and those sympathizers joining them in the killing. You're then getting routed by this military force. You're willing to engage in violent activity. Well, I don't think it's just these concentrations that matter. I think everybody was fleeing. Everybody's running in large numbers. Now, this is the animation we're working on now, because how do you make estimations of population movement from commune to commune in a country where there's very little discussion of it? Well, part of what the survey that we did in Butari talked about, and also some of the interviews and focus groups, all talked about movement, all talked about people fleeing. From the 12,000 eyewitness testimony I have from ICTR, there's also a lot of statements that talk about it. When they started firing their guns, we quickly sought refuge in our room and locked ourselves in. I know that there were both Hutus and Tutsis in our midst. I hid and fled during the entire period of the events of 1994. That's why I witnessed none of the events in which the authorities allegedly participated. Like all Rwandans, I fled because I feared for my life, given at that time people were killed for no reason. The result of the policy drafted by the high-ranking military leaders of the country was the daily killing of Tutsis and then later Hutus who did not agree with this policy. You must have heard of several cases of mass killing of Tutsis, such as those in Bugesera and those in Bogawi. Not far from here, in the Hutu opposition political leaders, these incidents were known by all. The records have indications of these issues, as well as people that were Tutsi hiding out with Hutu, driving in the same car with people, believing that they were of their ethnicity. Well, this gets this whole issue of, didn't people know who was who? They did locally. But again, get back to the movement of the population. Local knowledge is disrupted. These are the refugee populations outside of the country by December 1994. Again, 2 to 3 million estimation, but this doesn't include now the internal displaced numbers. These are just people that made it out of the country. Again, you'll notice this is where there was large numbers of people being killed in Kibuye that could not escape because of the huge lake. Intervention possibility. I'm almost done. I'm kind of like, Dallaire said if he had 5,000 troops, he could stop it. Intervention possibility. Where? When? Exactly where were you going to send the troops? Now, if it was 5,000 before anything happened, okay, maybe. But after it takes place, where do you send them? That discussion I haven't necessarily seen, so I wonder about this issue of the intervention possibility. Cooperman's attacks it in a different route. I'm just going off of strict logistics. You could argue that you go to the most level plane, given that that's where people might congregate, but that's also where the largest concentrations of those engaged in killing were to be located. Reconciliation possibility. If that's the distribution of the violence, that's just where people died, not where they were from initially. My question then is, where does one stop? How does one conduct reconciliation in this context when you have to reconstruct everything that we just went through and allow for the complexity of the violence? The random, the reprisal, the civil war, the genocide, the politicide. What's necessary then is a process that is open to this diversity, which it currently is not. So let me discuss a little bit about the conclusion, and then then I'm done. So genodynamics challenges most of the conventional wisdom. I find the violence highly diffuse and variable. I find a wide variety of types of killing, and I highlight interstate war, not civil war. You have troops coming from a foreign country into another country. That's interstate war, in political science at least. Now, if you're able to prompt the local population to join you, or it's indigenously started, that's the definition of civil war. So there's interstate war, there's genocide, there's politicide, there's war crimes, because there's a relationship between the violence of what the government is doing and what the challengers are doing. There's reprisal killings, there's random violence. We need to investigate all of it and parse responsibility and dynamics in that context. The identity, I step away from this ethnic identity, and I'm paying attention to political actors. It's the existing government that is a problem. It is the rebels that are a problem. Are there random actors that are the problem? I'm downplaying the ethnicity. I think it's there from the genocide and the politicide, but I'm also identifying that this is more like a totalitarian purge on the fly, being prompted to do so by someone who's about to take over their country. The number of individuals involved, I'm not quite sure. I'm not stepping there. Number of victims, mostly Hutu, some Tutsi, and some Twa. The number between 400,000 and 600,000. The importance of movement extremely high. The intervention possibility low. Reconciliation complexity, not necessity. Complexity high. What changes with the rethinking? Detection is hard to do of these events. It was not the easiest thing since the Holocaust to detect in terms of genocide. It is extremely complex to identify what took place. Intervention, act wisely, not faster, which involves having information about what is going on and this information being understood by different parties that are not highly politicized. The RPF, I hold them as accountable as everybody else for the violence, in fact, more so given the fact that I think they were driving some of it. Post-genocidal assistance, there's different forms of justice, there's different forms of activities that need to take place, but victors' justice should not go unchecked, which is what I think currently exists as the RPF tends to set the pace for everything that takes place in terms of justice in Rwanda. Insofar as peace building works, we need a broader, not a smaller, view of the violence. Currently, the violence is constructed around one form, genocide. It ignores the variety of activities that I've identified here and the implications of that variation and the nature of the relationship between them. It needs to be broader in terms of temporal considerations, the number of actors, the type of actors, the timing. We also need a broader view of post-violence. Wanted for genocide. This is setting the pace for what people are doing. Gacaca is structured extremely narrowly around the same exact point. The complexity that I've identified necessitates incorporation if we do get to a situation or have the possibility of moving to a situation of peace. As for future research, we need to deal with this migration issue. We need to understand the influence of flight and mass movement on the violent activity. We need to actually relate this radio hate argument, which people kind of keep tossing around. The number of individuals mentioned on the radio is never correlated to actually the number of people that are killed in any way, shape, or form. It might have been prevalent in one location, but not another. We need to get back to that. We need to code these freaking 12,000 ICTR testimonies. Help. I mean, we're trying all types of stuff. There's a lot of information in there. They finally released it to us. They've not allowed anybody else to have it. I don't think they want us to share it, but they gave it to us, so I'm out. I'm done. We need to compare the violence in genodynamics against violence reported in novels, films, and journalistic articles. This in part because I believe people come away from Rwanda with a sense that the modal killing was interfamilial. That father killed daughter or mother involved killing a cousin. How do you get to 800,000 people or 1 million people with that dynamic? I don't think you do. I think that's the modal survival story because you have 40,000 people dying in a stadium. the characterization of the violence needs to return back to understanding this large-scale nature of it and tracking those individuals and realizing that the discussion that we have currently is a function in part of who's left to listen to. And we need to assess the relationship between violence and post-violence, which is a science dissertation, which is good. And that was an extra slide, sorry. That's it. Open. Oh, I can do it. Okay.
You can direct them to Professor Davenport. There's a lot of numbers of people killed, and I know that's been a big debate because of how the information was gathered. I'm sorry Alexander Ford is not with us here today to hear your talk and the engagement process, because she herself was trying to gather that kind of information. Most numbers were gathered by people who had buried people and had lists, but those lists were not really reflective of who's actually buried sometimes. And you raised also a good point about what was pushing for the violence and the reaction. And I thought immediately about the Japanese internment in the United States during the war and how, as that war increased, our anxieties about having Japanese among us also increased. So that's a very interesting kind of thing I also want to look at. Help Americans understand how that reaction could take place anywhere. But I'm very curious, whose right is it to tell the story of what happened in Rwanda? I know you're looking at it from an academic perspective and how you want to tell what's really happening. But Rwandans are going to tell their stories also, and they're going to tell it from a very personal view, which means you may have stories about family violence, and you may not have the story that has a big picture. So
you can have fewer Rwandans than more that are talking though. So
okay, but still, there are individuals and there are groups, there are governments. Is it the international community's responsibility to say what happened in Rwanda, or is it Rwanda's responsibility to portray it in their own light?
Immediately personalize it, and I'll be like, I'm glad that anyone spoke about lynching in the United States or against slavery. I mean, we can't always wait for the victimized to be speaking about issues. And if human rights exist, that means humanity speaks up. So until I get some sense that that's not what people intended. I mean, I took Never Again to be like, everybody who's got a voice is empowered to say something about death and injustice. So I'm like, I'm all into that one. But then when you see Rwandans who are censored and they can't get their stories out, then I'm kind of like, all right, I'm not trying to champion any cause for them. And in part, I mean, there's a personal and the kind of academic bit for me. So part of this is my making up for not paying attention in '94. You know, that was just my mistake. And there should have been more voices that were out there that were doing that. And so part of this is, you know, I'm making up for my mistakes on that one. And trying to do it in a way that is sensitive to the fact that, you know, the Rwandan government evidently has the right to speak. I took what they had to say. There's NGOs who are speaking. I mean, so much of what I've done is basically compile the voices that have emerged anyway, and then all I've done is put them against one another to go, does this make any sense? Does it make sense that Verwimp, in conjunction with his modification of Abuka, gets 133 in one particular location while someone gets 11,000? Let's put that up there. So part of my thing is the debate's taking place, but it's a partial and fragmented and very hostile debate where many people are being blocked from participating in equal ways. So I'm just like, who's ever speaking on the topic is held accountable in my perspective, because I'm like, where's your data? Give it to me, and if you don't, I'm going to find some way to get it, and I'm going to put it up against everybody else's, and then you need to defend that number relative to other numbers. So I'm all about kind of accountability in transparency in social science as well. Now, this is, I'm sure everyone's got their Allison story now, but so my story with Allison is in 2004. They convened, the Rwandan government and the National University of Rwanda, Butare, convened a conference in Butare and Kigali, actually, for about 10 different groups of researchers to kind of talk about what they were discovering. And so I was one of these groups. I was there and, like, you know, sat down with Allison. And Allison was, like, real hostile to me and Alan at first, because she was like, I don't, you know, how could you say that? And I'm just like, all right. Because all she heard was it wasn't genocide and more Hutus died. And I'm like, hold it, that's not all I said. I said, let's get the whole story. So she got a day version of this where she was like, where'd you get that from? And like, so, you know, she grilled me. Anyone who Allison, she's like, you know, she's intense. She's small, kind of huddled over, but intense as hell and intimidating. So for a day, getting grilled by Allison was something. And so Allison goes, and here's my Allison story. No one can verify it other than Alan. But Allison was like, I'll never say this publicly, but I think you're moving in the right direction. And so I took that as, all right, good. And she didn't want to say anything publicly. In fact, her, Timothy Longman, all these people dogged us out. And that's because they wanted to go back to Rwanda. And I wanted the truth. So we had some different interests involved. So at the same conference is when Minister of the Interior and Minister of Defense threatened me and Alan. And I'm like, I'm done. I'm like, I'm done going to Rwanda. But I was just like, I'm not done with this. So I was, I take academic, the scholar activist thing in different ways. And so I was like, oh, you want to threaten my family? All right, fine. Let's deal with this. I'll be studying you for the rest of my life. That was my take. So I'm all for. Here's all the information that everyone has compiled. Here's my take on it, but make all the other information available. And I'm like, if you disagree, that's why the book's been taking so long. One, to compile everything, and also to figure out a way to make it user-friendly, because I'm just like, oh, okay, if you think the census estimate was wrong, then okay, fine. What else do you suggest? Here's that information. Here's UNHCR's information, and this is the conclusions I'm drawing given this read. So, yes?
You make an interesting distinction between acting fast and acting wisely, and given how quickly this thing took place and how short of a time, given the consequences of not acting fast, what do you think acting wisely might look like?
So part of it is, if you're looking at there's all these kind of African reports that are coming out from different agencies about what was taking place on the ground. So part of it is this issue of political will. So it seems like people had an understanding that something was going to happen ahead of time, and that wasn't enough to motivate people to take action. So part of my response initially is we need to get back to that understanding of political will and intervening earlier. But another part is this issue of, there's also documents that suggest in 88 and 89 that Kagame is told that if you push this effort, at a minimum 250,000 people are going to pass. And he's like, that's collateral damage to the war effort. I don't know where that comes into our understanding of we need to do something now when you have an invading force that has that particular orientation towards the thing that they're about to engage in, and awareness of exactly where that statement was made, who was aware at what point in time. So that becomes an issue as well. What becomes problematic for me is I end up coming out, and this is one of these awkward moments where I end up coming out on the side of, I think if the United States government, for an example, if the United States government said, we're not quite sure what's going on. There seem to be multiple forms of violence activity taking place in the country, and if we invade here to stop the violence, this is who we're empowering through that action. If we invade here, this is who we empower by that action. Because it's an odd thing where deals are already struck. RPF is going to be a minority political party. Everyone thought we were done. RPF doesn't want to accept that deal. So I'm like, even if we stepped in and stopped the violence at that particular point in time, I'm not quite sure that we would have been able to secure the same Arusha deal that had been basically already violated. So until the RPF got the country, I don't think they were going to stop, in which case there's not much we were going to be able to do. And I find that very problematic to say, because that says a lot about the kind of the possibilities of humanitarian intervention in situations where at least one of the parties involved is going to do what they want to do, and unless you're going to take them on militarily, that's just going to happen. So act wisely in this context ends up being behaviorally equivalent to there's not much we could have done.
What about the United Nations?
I mean,
at the end of the day, given the withdrawal of the United Nations?
So part of this gets back to the complexity issue. So it's not clear that it was straightforward what the United Nations should have done, unless they were ready to just take on the RPF, who everyone admitted to being one of the most efficient militaries in the region. And I don't know that the UN mandate was there. Clearly there's some rules that should have emerged to be like, okay, if your country happens to be on the Security Council at the time, your right to do anything is gone. You just need to kind of be declared out, and then they're pulled out, and then some other body is able to step in. But I don't think it was necessarily clear. until the UN is going to take a position. I mean, I think the R2P moves in the direction of suggesting that, hey, look, if you can't protect your people, then we'll do it for you. And that suggests a certain degree of militancy, and I don't know that we're necessarily ready to go there. That suggests that if this invading force is coming in and you cannot defend it, we will establish that order. And I don't know that the international community has gotten to that point yet. I mean, there's a presumption almost that the kind of bargaining model in international relations is appropriate to all contexts, and that the parties involved want to bargain. If one of the parties does not wish to bargain, they wish to take something over, that means you need to fight them. And I don't know that the UN has necessarily had that particular orientation towards the situation. They clearly need to move in that direction, but I don't see it yet. You had something?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on our responsibility, specifically whether they were conscious of it and whether it was intentional.
Yes. I mean, I think what's interesting, so the ICTR did not convict anyone on the conspiracy to commit genocide. It was kind of like this thing that emerged in the context of a crisis. That didn't really sound like that's genocide to me, in the sense that I thought it was a conspiracy. So then there's some other development going on, but the trace evidence for that conspiracy has not been readily apparent yet. The actor that seems clear on almost all aspects of what took place before they invaded, through the event. I mean, so the RPF has got an office in D.C. to which they're sending updates about where they are in terms of troop movements, whether or not they need help. RPF is like, nah, we don't need help, we're good. Many appeals, can we assist? Nothing. So I believe that they had the most efficient fighting machine, they had the most efficient monitoring and surveillance of what was taking place, and they also were well aware of what was taking place both at the front, in front of the front, and behind the front. I mean, in the animation, you see them hold a particular position for an awful long time. So up along the north, around the top, they kind of hold sway while, like a clock, they're moving through the country. Now, this is a U.S. military strategy. You affix a position, and then you move around like a clock to sweep the country. But they're also trying to move people to Congo, and that also was not random. They wanted to move in that direction. And so there's a tremendous degree of, I think, command, control, responsibility that sits at their foot. But at the same time, the way the international law is set up, it's the FAR that would be held accountable. That's if it's genocide. If it becomes a war crime, then you're trying to get to this dynamic interaction between the two parties, which I think is somewhat more accurate to the context of the violence. But as long as we're kind of fixed to the prism of genocide, then I think that's precluding this broader understanding of the dynamics involved. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the mysteries of violence, you allow me to use the word mystery, is the action that precipitates the violence. The bringing down of the plane of the president, the then President Abiy Ahmed, maybe you call it conventional wisdom, but the bringing down of the plane kind of brings about an environment of confusion, an environment of insecurity. Do you have some insights? I mean, the domains unclear about who brought down the plane, what the intention was. Do you have some insight to share on that? And secondly, a lot of your analysis focuses on after the violence breaks out. And I wonder whether that will change if we look into, perhaps some time, going back before the violence breaks out, into the planning, into the arming, into the preparation. Does that change the dynamic? Because usually when violence breaks out, there's a lot of confusion. People are afraid. People kill, if people have arms, they use them. And I think that is captured in your analysis. But part of, assigning responsibility for who was responsible for what, I think should go a little further into the planning, the circumstances, the whole dynamics before the violence actually breaks out.
I mean, so plane is like, you know, who shot down the plane is a huge kind of controversy now. But I'm like, I'm less on the plane than I am the invasion. I'm just like, yeah, the plane going down was bad, but you already have troops that have taken over like a large section of the northern part of your country that are there. And I'm like, 87, 88, it was a dictatorship. It was a totalitarian dictatorship, but no one was getting killed in large numbers. We don't start seeing mass displacement and large numbers of people getting killed until the invasion. So I'm like, the plane was bad, but the interstate war was worse. Now, the planning thing, I think you're right. I'm like, if I could find those documents that showed, you know, the Chinese ships that kind of sent the machetes into the country and the disbursements of the weapons ahead of time. But my thing is, people with far more resources than myself, the ICTR and so forth, they've been trying to find the kind of like smoking gun partially to kind of identify what the nature of the relationship was with the preparations. And I'm like, no one's shown me any kind of information that definitively, clearly identified what was going on. Now, I'm like, you don't kill a couple 100,000 people in an uncoordinated way in a few weeks. So clearly there's some plan. And so if you take in my simulation just the red squares. So if you're just looking at the large scale killing, and that's the stuff above, that's the stuff above like 1,000. I mean, these are the places that I think, you know, we need to focus in on. Because I think there's something to be said about places where more than 1,000 people are killed, or 5,000 or 10,000 people are killed. That suggests that there's coordination. You need coordination to pull that off. And so I think that's kind of guiding the effort now. Part of my thing is, it's hard to go back prior to 94, in part because this is the reason I was doing the kind of like media content analysis, hardly anyone's paying attention to them. Allison was one person paying attention to it, but Human Rights Watch's attention span, and even Amnesty occasionally, it's not as persistent as it needs to be. They got some flashpoints about things that were going on and some hate speech, but they weren't tracking weapons. They heard some rumors about training taking place, but no one had like a map of these are the training camps throughout Rwanda. Here's the code book of what they were using for regards to the training. So what we have is just kind of relatively spotty information about that. And it's hard to go from that to the concerted plan that would be necessary to kind of talk about some of the issues. So you don't get this unless you have a plan. But we don't have the plan. And the information we're getting from people now is just so distorted, it's really hard to kind of piece together what that plan was. So if you have some way to kind of navigate that, then fine. But in 12 years, I haven't figured this out. And with all the attention given to the 100 days, that's one of the reasons why I have so much information. Because a bunch of people said that's what we focus in on, the 100-day period. I mean, Minaloke, the Minister of Local Affairs, they have some information on some Civil War violence, but no one talks about that report anymore. They talk about other stuff. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you. Yep.
If we knew exactly who did it and they were prosecuted to the fullest extent of international law, would humanity be better off? And I have to follow.
The people who did that?
That's what we're talking about.
Define better off.
Would it be a benefit to humanity?
As a social scientist, I say yes. Since most large-scale killings, the locations tend to recur, which suggests that there are repeat offenders internationally. And so we would do our best to contain those individuals. You had a follow-up?
Which are more beneficial to humanity.
I think Rwanda would love to hear those. Okay.
I want to ask, what does the events of 90 to 92, how does that play into your narrative, if at all? After all, I mean, it's so often forgotten that there was what looks like a civil war. I mean, tell me what you think about it. It looks like a civil war, 2 years earlier. I would think that would tend to corroborate your story because one could say that, look, there was something very much like the Civil War with very large scale death 2 years before the genocide, whatever exactly it was, starts. Does it make sense that that might be a continuation of what was going on? So what do you do with those years?
I mean, so with the invasion, you have the commandeering of the northern part of the country, but you also have the move of several 100,000 people into Kigali. But then you also have, from Burundi, individuals that are fleeing, that are coming into the country from an earlier killing there. So you've already got people kind of positioned within the country who don't have any kind of local connections, who are easily riled up and trained to do different things. So I think clearly there's a dynamic there. And then, I mean, if you just, I mean, I stopped in '94, but clearly '94 to the present then involves this other issue of then the kind of relationship between Congo and the Rwanda, and so there is this continuity. So I think there's a large amount of kind of bracketing of, if we're just trying to understand Rwanda '94, what kind of purchase can we get on doing that? But I believe that we need to actually, part of the kind of broadening temporally argument was we need to kind of go back a little bit further than we do. I'd actually go back before 1990 to start looking at the training in Uganda and what's taking place to Tutsis in Uganda, but also let's more seriously look at what's going on with Tutsis and political moderates in Rwanda in '86 and '87. We kind of forget about that process, but then also push it forward to come up to '98 and 2000. Part of the issue there is getting information about what's actually going on in Rwanda and around Rwanda at the time is extremely contentious. I mean, but we know there's all types of raids that are taking place within Rwanda, but that serves as cover for some activities that they're doing, and then objectivity with regard to those announcements becomes somewhat problematic. But then the persecutions of people within Rwanda in terms of that political space in the upcoming election. So I think I'm all for more information, pushing both behaviorally and temporally. So I think part of the problem with Rwanda is Rwanda now is synonymous almost with genocide by itself. We forget behavioral context. We also forget temporal context. And we're rewarded for doing that, and we're sanctioned for violating it. So I'm trying to get to more of that. Yeah.
Question. When I was watching the animations, especially of the battlefront moving, and even with the maps that show the low-level conflict, not just the high stuff like this, there was rarely any actual deaths on the battlefront.
Yeah.
So how is the RPF advancing through the country without any deaths on the battlefront?
Dallaire says in his testimony in ICTR, and also within his book, it's because the FAR was weak. They were running. They weren't trying to fight. They acknowledged relatively early on that they did not have the capability to take them on in a kind of standing battle, and thus it becomes these skirmishes. So there's very few of those kind of violent activities. These are the lower killings, below 500, I believe.
Firing from top of the hillsides, almost hurting the FAR off the front line, despite positioning themselves around the country and firing in the air and just scaring them into leaving the area, making it look like they were larger numbers. They're very, very incredible tacticians.
FAR needs to watch more movies.
These could have been killed. It's just a logical possibility. You don't need any simulation. Any of the numbers out there that look like 600,000 to 1 million, you're going to see that you don't need to know where they happened at all. You just need the absolute numbers to derive the fact that a lot of Hutus, and probably more than Tutsis, were killed. And that just strikes me as surprising. That the question then is, you would think that other people would notice this. I mean, and it makes me wonder, having been in the developing world a bit, how reliable are those numbers you're relying on? I mean, how confident are you that you've got the right number of Tutsis before? Because statistics offices are famously bad at measuring numbers. They're often very politically motivated. And so, I mean, that's got to be absolutely tight for your whole argument for, because if that's off, then everything goes off, as far as I can tell.
Well, so part of my thing is, it's kind of interesting. So if the Rwandan government isn't thorough in identifying ethnicity, then you don't have the strong state that's necessary to conduct a genocide. That seemed to always follow for me. So I'm like, okay, either they're good or they're not. If they are decent, their number 600,000, do we get that number or anywhere close to that number through any other ways? Yeah. So some went back to the census for 73 and imputed forward. They're like, okay, that's more or less in the realm. Okay, but 73 could be off as well. But it's a different political context. It's a little bit less sensitive. So then some go back even further to kind of Belgian censi, and then they kind of project forward. Is it in the margin of error? Yeah. What's interesting is neither one of those talked about how many people you thought left in 59 and 60. And so we just kind of came up to that. And then no one considered the UNHCR kind of flight in and out of the country. And so what's the ethnicity of the people leaving? If you accept the narrative that potentially persecuted individuals, the Tutsi in this context, or politically challenging Hutu would leave, more on the former than the latter, then that plays with that kind of general estimation. So part of the reason for doing this was we either think the governments are good at identifying their people. So William Seltzer makes this whole argument that most genocides follow censi. That's just how governments find who they're trying to kill before they go do it. So that kind of argument works. But if they're bad with that estimation, then how are they so good at tracking down everybody later on? I'm like, it just, it didn't make any sense. So the only reason I kind of went in this direction with regards to focusing in on, do we have any other concurrent validation for the census estimates, is to kind of tease out the state capacity bit. Either they do have some capacity, in which case the rest of the narrative makes sense, because if they're not good at identifying the population, then they're probably not good at giving out the ID cards, and then they're probably not good at manning, so all these implications kind of follow from the efficiency of the census. So that range in and of itself was kind of like, granted, this is like 3 weeks old, because it just occurred to us. We had the UNHCR data for like years, and we were just like, wow, what if we considered people leaving the country and consider that relative to these other estimations? And then we delved out this, and we were like, what about 59? Really, we just got back to 59 a couple of months ago, because we were just like, wow, we're just assuming that number back then was correct. But is there any other information about people leaving? And then you get to the politics of it. The RPF don't want to make it seem as if a whole bunch of Tutsi left back then, because that decreases their mandate later on, the legitimacy of their invading another country. If there's 5,000, extreme, if there's 5,000 Tutsi in the country and the majority of the people left, there's no mandate for coming in and invading. That's our land. So you need enough people that are there to kind of justify you going in, but not too many to make it seem like you're a minority that are just kind of kicking your way in there. So the politics of that number and the difference and the range seem to be kind of like really important enough to kind of go into. But I'm definitely sensitive to your point. You had a point?
I think we can take one more question, and then you can ask Dr. Davenport questions if you will. You have to come around for a while. We'll take one more.
A comment you made, I would like you to clarify. I'm Rwanda. You said something like whenever the RPF stopped and whenever they pushed in, there were more killings. Are you saying that there were more killings because RPF was pushing, or because the FAR were running and killing more people on the way?
Both.
I'm saying the FAR push, the RPF push forward. People are flying. The RPF is fleeing, and they're killing. The FAR. Yeah, if we're doing the actual bodies doing the killing, that's the FAR and their associates. The context within which they're doing it, the RPF has just pushed them, and then they're engaging in killing. That would be a follow-up, but go ahead.
I almost agree with you that more Hutus were killed. I'm not a scholar. If I think that more Hutus were killed because there just were more Hutus in the country, so it makes sense that more Hutus died early on, not because RPF killed them.
I don't think it was clear at all who anybody was, and in that context, anybody who was fleeing or congregating was viewed as threatening, and they were killed by all parties.
It's clear we could continue discussing because of this terrific presentation for a long time, and come ask individual questions, but I'm sure you have other things to do eventually. So thanks very much for